Call the general plan working meeting to order for Thursday, November 2nd, 2023. Can we have roll call, please?
Chairman Stanish,
Here.
Vice Chair Hetchman. Here. Member Okamura,
Here.
Member Donnelly,
Here.
Member Holtzlander,
Here.
Member Adamson. Here. Member Darden,
Here.
alternate Member Dolk,
Here.
alternate Member Duke. Here.
Okay, everybody's here. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. There's nobody here in chambers for public comment. Is there anybody online?
There are none, Chair.
Okay, so I'll close public comment for now. Action items, approval of the October 5th, 2023 minutes. Anybody have any questions in regard to the minutes? All right, then do we have a motion to approve?
I'll move we approve as submitted.
I'll
second.
All right, we have a first and a second.
Donnelly,
Yes.
Member Holtzlander,
Yes.
Chair Stanish,
Yes.
Vice Chair Hetchman,
Yes.
Member Okamura,
Yes.
Member Adamson, Member Darden.
Yes. Okay. We're gonna move on to discussion items. The first one is 4.1 land use map revisions. Oh, I guess that's you.
Good evening, Chair, members of the General Plan Working Group. Meeting 20 this evening. We're getting close to the end. It's been a bit of a run, but we are bringing forward to you one additional element this evening, as well as some land use changes. Next slide. We'll start out looking at some refinements to the General Plan land use map, go over the draft safety element, and then just some announcements this evening. So relatively light agenda. On to the land use revisions. So there's two areas of the map that we want to look at. One is the city's 62.5 acre property. We've been in the process of preparing an entitlement study for how that land might be developed. To date, we had a placeholder of residential and a block of multifamily, and we now have a more refined plan developed through that process that we want to share with you. There is an area in the industrial land on the river we want to look at as well. And then we're going to talk about a proposed new residential designation. So next slide. The two areas we're going to discuss are outlined in red, the city property and the industrial area. Let's jump on into the city property here. On the left, you see the designations in the current draft land use plan. Predominantly neighborhood residential, does have a light industrial for that Grimmer property that has now been brought back into city ownership, and so will be incorporated into whatever happens with this property. And then we had a multifamily residential at the corner of Church and Airport. We've gone through a fairly extensive evaluation of how this property could best be developed. And what we've determined is that this is a good site for some additional density. What you see here is still the majority of the property is neighborhood residential, which is really conventional single family lots. And then an area that's identified as multifamily residential along both Church and Airport. We'll get into this in the last topic, but that multifamily residential is not all of one kind. There's 5 acres within that, which would actually be high density, would be apartments in character. There's about 10 acres that would be what we're thinking of as medium density residential. So that could be like townhouses or, higher density, but not apartment complexes. Half the density of an apartment complex. We also are anticipating we'll put in some small lot single family, which is standalone single family homes, but just on smaller lots. that the density of all of those products exceeds what we have today as far as neighborhood residential, which only allows up to 7.5 units per acre. I think that after tonight's discussion, if the group is supportive, we'll have an additional designation called medium density residential. And you'll see about 2/3 of that multifamily move over to this kind of in-between density that is somewhere between small lot, single family, duplexes, triplexes, and townhomes. So, but for now, these are the designations we have. There is a larger park on Harris Road and a small park up near the primary detention basin at Church and Airport. And then we did discuss this tag property. It's not actually part of the city's 62 acres, but it's adjacent to the homecoming project. We discussed that at our previous meeting, and the group did support taking that to a multifamily density, a higher density. And that was a request from the property owner, and so that's now reflected. So that's the big change that we have to discuss. I'd be happy to take comments, guidance, answer any questions.
What kind of road does that lower piece?
It's gonna be this.
Wasn't talking about that. Oh, I talked about that. I was talking-
Very low is.
The discussion was whether it would follow that kind of right of way that we have that is directly between the orange block and homecoming, or whether it would go through the center of the property. And honestly, we don't know at this time. That's something we would explore with the owners of the property when they wanted to come forward for development. What we do know is at a minimum, we're looking for a bike ped connection from what you see as the park down to the business park. May also be a through road, but we don't know exactly. It's going to depend on the geometrics and the ability to get the road in, and that will get explored with a future project.
What were the considerations to move away from having the higher density, the apartments, to the townhomes or single lots, the small homes?
Well, we only ever intended to have about 5 acres of apartments. What we're really seeing is that we want to bring in this land use that's in between density. So single family residential is maybe 7.5 units per acre maximum. Small lot, single family can get up to about 10 acres, 10 units per acre. Medium density can push up to about 15 units the acre. And then apartments are up to 25 units.
Right now, I get all the measurements, but why? What's the change in having that less density, high density measures, the small homes versus more apartments?
We would not feel comfortable with that much apartments. What we've generally seen is that apartment complexes need to operate with about 100 to 125 units to be viable. But when they get larger, they are not really as much assets to the community and become more problematic. They're a little bit overwhelming. So we do want to have a measure of high density, and that will help us with our affordable housing targets. But we didn't want to see nearly that much as high density, but rather a combination of these. You know, we oftentimes call it workforce housing. So entry level, new teachers, new firefighters, folks who can't really get into a standalone single family home. It provides that bridge to the next house.
I'm not sure whether you covered this or not. Across the road from Church, in the red, is that neighborhood mixed use or is that highway commercial?
It's neither. And I would have to get back to the map and tell you, I think it's a commercial designation. I know it's a commercial designation. I don't think it's highway. I think we may have rebranded that, but I could answer that in just a
Okay.
second.
It looks like it's on your attachment A. The draft land use.
I think
map
we already,
revisions.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it
Right.
looks like it's the middle shade.
Which is neighborhood, which would then.
I'm
because-
sorry, it is highway.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
it's neighborhood mixed use. Yeah.
okay, so under neighborhood mixed use, are you able to put in strip mall or stores? Because we had talked about that
Yeah.
originally was, okay,
Yeah,
you can, okay,
Neighborhood mixed use accommodates primarily commercial and allows some
Perfect.
housing. But
That's-
it's
oh.
more oriented towards commercial than housing.
good, thank you.
And just a quick question. What's the small rectangle that's next to the large park?
That's a detention basin.
Okay.
We would have two detention basins within the project. There's an outfall from Homecoming that comes out there.
It doesn't look like there's anybody online for any public comment on this.
No public comment.
Okay.
Are we good to go?
Mhm.
Okay, these changes will be incorporated into the latest draft map. Next slide. This one's a little bit more straightforward. We had identified all of the land north of Airport Road and along the river that isn't currently developed as residential. We identified all of it as general commercial. But when we look at the uses that are on the ground, that area in red that we now call industrial limited, it's really much more characteristic of limited industrial. It's mini warehouse, it's some storage, and there's a building that's currently being used for yeah, I know everyone's excited about storage. This is existing uses. So there's another kind of open air boat and RV storage there, as well as some small industrial buildings. And then on River Road, there is a use that has been somewhat problematic for us in that it's the garden center use, and but it is operating as a kind of wholesale commercial, which fits best into the industrial limited category. So just looking at what's on the ground, the industrial limited is more appropriate for these properties. The industrial general is heavier industrial in nature, more construction related, or really more impactful uses. So the recommendation is that these lands would go to industrial limited.
I know that there's discussion at our previous meeting about the industrial limited or the residential. And we had originally talked about having residential along that. And then you said that there is a reason why we couldn't. Is there a reason, since this is a 25-year looking forward document, why we do have that little cutout for that one property? Couldn't that be residential?
It's currently designated residential, but not developed as residential. That property has been developed for industrial uses for about 40 years.
So it could be it would be a non-conforming use if we changed it. And that's when that rule kicks in, where as long as if they sell it to another person that's doing the same thing, it could be retained as such, right?
I'm not sure when the residential designation was applied, but there was an interruption of use. They lost their non-conforming status. It's not a legal non-conforming, it's an illegal use.
No, right. I'm talking about in the future, if we're looking 25 years forward, do we want that to be industrial limited? And that's probably a question for the group,
Yes,
because that's going to be, that is residential, right? I mean, there's residential across the street, there's residential next to it. It seems odd that we're going to have that little cutout over there versus just having it more a square above. And I think that's a question for everyone. It seems to me it should be residential, but I defer to the
well,
group.
it is currently designated residential. It's currently developed non-residential.
Right.
But one of the problems, and I don't know exactly where we'll land on this, it's not developed as residential, and I don't know if we'll have a problem with the Delta Stewardship Council or the Delta Protection Commission, but they're pretty adamant about they do not want to see any new residential uses.
Okay, so that
in
was the reason
primary
why.
Delta.
Okay,
It's a factor. It's a factor in this.
okay. But they don't have a problem with the existing residential.
I understand that that was built, it was built legally, then nobody questioned it. So they're not in the business of saying we're going to tear down houses, but they really are pretty adamant about not having residential uses built within the primary delta, and this is, I think it's a mistake in the way this is designated. I don't agree with how the lines were drawn, but somebody was drawing a delta boundary that covered many counties and they just used Airport Road. But for whatever reason, that's how it's written, and it would take an act of the state legislature to change it, which I'm told is not going to happen.
All right.
So,
Fair enough.
I have a question. So we were supposed to, our
Jackie.
planning commission meeting, we were supposed to discuss the garden center garden depot designation. They wanted it changed so that they weren't out of compliance. Is that why our meeting was canceled? Because you're changing it here and it doesn't need to be, does it need to go through planning then? Or why, I was curious why that was canceled.
I'm blanking. about
It was
cancel.
canceled because it's currently zoned residential, and if we
Oh, thank you.
change it to industrial now, we have to replace it with residential, the same acreage and residential, and there's no lots to change it to.
Yeah, there's a state law that's called no net loss. So whenever you take property that's currently zoned for residential, if it could accommodate 10 units, 100 units, whatever, you have to do a rezone somewhere else in the city at the same time. We weren't in a position at that time to do that swap. In the case of the general plan as a whole, we're actually going to wind up with considerably more residential land because we're bringing in the city's 62-acre site. So we won't have issues with no net loss, but thank you, Robin, for reminding me. That was why the item got canceled, is we could not legally move forward with that rezone.
Okay, I have another question then. So when we first started this process, we looked at what we thought our population would top out at in 2045. I think we were 16 or 17,000.
Yep.
So since you're including this 62 acres now in your residential, do we need to look at that number again? Or is that number pretty much going to stay the way?
That's considered within the 16,500
Oh,
projection.
it is.
Yeah.
Okay, wasn't sure.
And the 16,500 is also based on a rate of growth, not simply available land. So we think we can build that many houses between now and 2045.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm confused. This was, if the garden center was residential and they're currently out of compliance and you're wanting to change it in the next general plan, that's what I'm understanding you say?
Yes.
So isn't the actual answer then to Edwin's question is that it could actually remain residential and they just remain out of compliance? Because it currently is, which would mean that the Delta shouldn't have a problem with it.
The question is the difference between a built property and a designated property. They're pretty adamant about constructing new residential regardless of what the designation is. So there's both, we certainly aren't going to designate new residential. That would be an absolute no starter. If this group is very interested in seeing this retained as residential, we can push for that and find out if that would be considered consistent. The problem is that we would have a residential designation for essentially undeveloped land, and we'd have to sell that. So the commission was not particularly easy to work with so far. So, but if there's a strong interest in retaining this as a residential site for the future, then we'll go forward and work on that. Yeah.
It seems to me that we should. I mean,
Okay.
just by looking at the map, and it just
Well-
looks so odd to have that little piece just cut out for something else. I mean, it looks like it's a entranceway from River Road into that property to me, where, I mean, you've got obviously residential right up next to it.
You will have residential directly next to industrial, no matter what in this
Right.
scenario, because the way this is developed out there.
Right.
I just need direction. We'll go.
Yeah, I
with that.
just think, circling back to the earlier days, the whole idea of wanting to have that area more available as residential along the waterfront. I mean, that was the whole reason that we really looked at taking everything north of the bridge and sending it that direction. So I'm in agreement having this little tooth here as a holdout. I don't think makes sense in a land use plan. I mean, it looks like something that might be detailed in a zoning plan or something, but yeah, It
Okay,
seems like
s-
kind of tail wagging the dog here.
So what we're talking about is the two parcels that front to River Road staying as residential.
Yes.
And I'm not really
Correct.
hearing anybody
Yes.
stressing other points, so I think I have my direction.
Okay.
About that one last little piece, that's, is
It's,
that zone industrial or residential right now?
it's zoned industrial
Ah,
now.
okay.
And it's developed industrial now, so to push more would be that direction where I think it's definitely a no start with the commissions. So,
You say either way you look at it, you're gonna have some industrial next to housing.
you are, the garden center is a relatively benign use to be next to. What's next to the garden center is not as accommodating. But, you know, I think I got the direction. That will mean that the garden center property is unusable. So we all understand that, right?
For a garden center.
For any commercial use,
Right.
and it's developed as a
Right.
commercial use, and they have not been a good player, candidly. They've done work on the property without approvals, without permits. But there's a lot of investment that is going to now have to go away.
Well, it's not going away. It'd be a non-conforming use.
No, it's illegal. It will have to go away.
They'd have to tear it down.
I believe so. They'll have
You
to at
told
least
us-
tear down to what was pre-existing. Because they've constructed a lot of buildings out there in the past 2 years.
Yes.
Illegally, yes, they were aware that it
Oh,
was
wow.
zoned residential.
Then
And they
No,
don't
I'm
have a
sorry.
business license either, from my understanding.
Right.
They've never had a business license, they never pulled building permits, and they had been informed of the zoning prior to making these improvements, so.
I don't feel bad then.
Yeah, I was
All right.
gonna ask, is that the group just kind of popped up?
Direction's clear, thank you. Okay, the last part of this is to discuss the additional designation, and so we kind of talked through this already, but it feels like there's a gap. We go from single-family residential, and the next broadly applied designation is multifamily, which is apartment. It's pretty traditional to have something in between there that is this higher density, single family up to townhouse. And we're proposing that as a new medium density regulation or medium density residential. And as proposed would be allowing up to 16 units per acre. So single family stops at 7.5. This would take us up to 16 dwelling units per acre. And then the multifamily would take us up to 25 units per acre. So, make sense?
Mhm.
Any questions, comments? Great, next slide. The working group already reviewed the goals, policies, and programs from the safety element at the last meeting. So now we're taking a look, and we distributed to you the body of the safety element. And candidly, this is a pretty technical element, and there's probably only one element with more specific state mandates than safety, and that's the housing element. So there's a lot of items that have to be touched on and described. What we want to do is get your thoughts. I will acknowledge at this point that we did not, as our normal practice is, provide you a Word document ahead of time. Nick and I realized that this morning. So we would like to get that Word document out to anyone like Lisa and Judith who love to comment on Word documents, which we really appreciate. Really, really appreciate. So the other Lisa. No, the input has been fabulous. So, but we're also here to take comments this evening, answer questions. So this is the first time that you've seen the body of the safety element itself, and that's what we're here to discuss. Any input you have, we'll go ahead and update the element, and then it will go into, you know, what we consider the preliminary draft stage. So with those opening comments, is there anything that anybody reviewed that you would like to identify, go over, questions?
Yes, I have a couple. I just saw something, so.
Okay.
Go ahead, Art.
Go ahead.
Under local emergency response, it talks about the fire, police and fire. And I think there is an error here on the last line. It says relies largely, Rio Vista Fire provides, under contract, provides services on the east side of the bridge up to the Antioch Bridge. And it says the fire department relies largely on volunteers for firefighting and emergency response. That's not true. Rio Vista Fire Department is professional firefighters, paid, and they are the ones that are responding. It is not Montezuma or any other volunteer fire department.
So it's just the statement of volunteers is erroneous. I think we
Yes.
may have gotten crossed up on Montezuma and Rio Vista. Thank you.
Well, are probably gonna lay over collapsed. Volunteer.
You could
I agree.
argue that we use other agencies because there is multi-agency calls are pretty frequent, but the volunteers. I don't know. Yeah, I would say.
No, we are a professional firefighting department. Thanks. Is that it? Art?
Yes, and the other thing I had was evacuation routes. The evacuation routes is basically if we're evacuating or trying to evacuate Rio Vista, it's Highway 12, which is not an acceptable evacuation route. Trying to move a number of people. Realistically, if we were evacuating because of a flood or something, the Delta would be out because it's all low-lying. You could very easily lose the Delta. And so you're going one direction on Highway 12, which is a 2-lane highway. There really is no realistic evacuation route from Rio Vista if you want to move large people. And
Montezuma would be in route as well, right?
yeah,
And McCormick.
Yeah.
yeah, I would actually stay off 12 because there's low-lying areas of 12.
Mm-hmm.
There,
But this is based on the low lying waters, the feed. Yeah, they inundate downtown.
Yeah.
and flooding is only one. I mean, I think wildfire is as likely. Or it may be an event that happens on the road. So it might be that we're actually evacuating across the river because something's happened on the road that we need to get away from. So
I'm like, there's,
I appreciate the comment, but I think we're gonna be staying with it as our evacuation route, as inadequate as it might be. I don't know that there's a better.
there isn't an alternative. Just a comment.
Thank you.
They just don't feel safe.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Thank you, Art.
Invest in airplanes.
There's plenty of hangar space.
Oh, Bill Paul.
Emmett, I think
Yeah.
you were up next.
I just happened to notice in the paragraph, the climate change vulnerability assessment, 1.1.2. Near the end, it talks about the public wastewater facilities along the river are most vulnerable. Isn't that being
It's not
cut
gone,
out?
it's not gone yet.
transferred, or-
Yeah, we're still in that process and
I didn't know how.
it's a
far along we
it's a
were.
proposal and we're still going through the rate study and stuff, but even best case scenario to be there for another 5+ years.
And today it is our most vulnerable
Yeah,
infrastructure.
okay.
I have a question. And it might be obvious, but have we done this as far as reaching out to police and fire departments to see what their 2 cents are in the emergency response? Because there might be something that we don't know about.
We worked with police and fire on the public facilities and services element in depth. I don't think that this document was routed to them and. You sure?
I don't know if they responded, but they were on the
Okay.
same email I was on.
Okay.
Okay. Then on figure, I don't know if we've gotten this far yet, but on figure 2, page 1 of 5, the red areas of possible restraints in evacuation, what are those restraints? Because it's not like they're,
I'm not wild about this methodology, but it is the methodology our consultant used. The firm Placeworks did our housing element, also the safety element. What they looked at is when somebody is more than 2 turns and has only one way to go, 2 segments where there's no other options. And I think it's kind of an algorithm of mapping that to me it hasn't provided a particularly meaningful description of constrained evacuation, because I see these areas in developments that I just don't really believe are constrained. I think it's a bit of a false answer, but it's the answer that their algorithm came up with. So, and I don't have a good alternative, and we do have to map constrained evacuation routes. It's a state law requirement. And so short of us coming up with a different methodology, which I didn't feel like was worth the effort that we would have to undertake.
but the obvious property though, and what I'm looking at is the one at the corner of Azevedo and Highway 12. I mean, why would you need 2 turns there? I mean, you're right on either Azevedo or right on 12.
As I recall, I'm not
That's
looking
the
at,
undeveloped brand.
yeah, that's Brand Ranch.
And
And-
so that's the one house, there's one house out there right
Right.
now. Once Brand Ranch develops, it will no longer be red.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So again, it's kind of a false positive. And there's other instances where it
looks most of Trilogy is that way. And that's not good. That's not good for old people, right, Lisa? Oh, sorry.
It's okay, my house is clear. I'm in the
we
clear.
had a special algorithm for Trilogy. So I honestly, we ran into some instances with some of the mapping where, okay, it's justified by their methodology, but it's not passing the common sense test.
Well,
Yet we
from
do
what you
have-
said,
we do
it-
have to have a map and a documentation.
Yeah.
So.
it's like algebra. Doesn't make sense. So they have to use it. Okay. That's all the questions I have. Anybody else? Anybody online?
None online, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Paul.
We will circulate the Word version, and for the folks who are willing to give it that in-depth review, we really do appreciate it. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, next steps. A bit of good news. Whenever you update more than 2 elements of a general plan, you have to address environmental justice. That can be in the form of having an environmental justice element, or it can come in a series of policies where you go through your document and identify how you're going to address the inequities that have resulted over time. Typically, that's typically you see that as the siting of lower income housing next to railroads, industrial areas. You see exposure of people with lower means to poor environmental conditions. Interestingly, the census tract in which Rio Vista is located is identified on what's called Cal EnviroScreen as a subject to environmental justice. So it's a disadvantaged census tract. The quick answer is we therefore have to do an environmental justice element, but we did retain, again, some folks at Placeworks who have been very helpful on many aspects of this plan to look at environmental justice, and they did a deep dive. And so instead of just looking at Cal EnviroScreen, they looked at the specific criteria that leads to a determination of disadvantaged community. And there's a whole bunch of specific criteria. And once they did investigations and said, yes, there's a fair number of sites with contamination in the census tract, but they're all in the county. They're not in Rio Vista. Yes, there's these things showing up, but as soon as they looked really at Rio Vista, they were able to screen it out. And they came back to us with a determination that, in fact, we don't believe the requirements of SB 1000 apply in Rio Vista, and that you in fact do not have an obligation to address environmental justice. I was actually having a bit of trouble contemplating how we were going to meaningfully address environmental justice, because I don't think it particularly exists in Rio Vista in the sense of what that law is intended to address. So at this point, we are not anticipating going back into environmental justice, going back through the document to identify policies to remedy those issues.
Do we have to include that analysis from the consultant in the general plan? Just
We will have a reference to it, and it will be an attachment to, but not part of the general plan. So it will be available for anybody who reviews it.
Is that going to impact our Cal environmental determination?
No, the EnviroScreen determination will still be in place, and Robin's asking because that helps us with grant funds.
And great.
Yes.
And I have another grant question as well. Under environmental injustice, doesn't trees fall under that within neighborhoods? I know that might be an odd question. I read an article in Atlantic a number of months ago, and it talked about in impoverished areas, tree planting and lack of trees is a huge injustice because there's no cooling, right? There's no cooling within those neighborhoods. And I ask that because maybe this is an opportunity to get grant funded. Because I think there's a lot of areas all the way out to Liberty Island that we have deserts. We have pathways that are deserts, and we need trees badly, even on Front Street as well.
I think that has more to do with the concrete jungle lack
Yes.
of trees, because it's not just like the cooling effect, it's the air circulation, the air cleaning and all of that. Versus we don't really have that issue, but for grants, we are in the Cal Environmental 4.0 as a disadvantaged community, which is basically an injustice. And so we should be able to capitalize on that.
Okay.
Trees were not a factor that was identified in the PlaceWorks memo. So for the determination under SB 1000, tree canopy was not a factor that they looked at. So, but I agree, you certainly see better canopy in more affluent neighborhoods and far less canopy in lower income neighborhoods.
Right. I just want money.
is that changing though with more modern developments though? Is that starting to change?
There's two big factors that are changing canopy. One is our lots are getting smaller, so instead of having room for a tree in your yard, you're either have it too close to your house or too close to the sidewalk, creating problems. The other is just the access for solar power. So now with more efficient construction and solar, your energy balance is going to be better without the tree using your solar power and your efficient house. So there's a couple of factors. And as a certified tree hugger, I'm not wild about this because I love tree canopies, and when they start to touch in the middle of the street, I think it's wonderful. But it's not nearly as feasible with higher density development that we conventionally see now.
We can make it in our development agreements though, can't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can require planting of trees.
Yeah.
You can
tree
even
huggers.
establish regulations that say those trees can't be removed. Because I will tell you, in my neighborhood, every yard had 2 trees in the front yard. And there's darn few that still have those trees.
And you
Because
know them
people-
all by name, right?
As a certified
George,
tree hugger.
Sam. They are, yeah. Yeah, they've taken the trees out because trees represent, kind of a commitment of maintenance. If you're really gonna take care of it.
Well, and it also depends on where your sewer lines and your water lines are going into your house. Like in my old neighborhood, they planted the trees right where all the sewer lines went through. So everybody that looked and said it said S, everybody pulled the trees out.
Because they will get into those lines over time.
Paul,
Just-
I'm sorry.
Just a little side note, with schools and the state, we're now having to deal with the Cal Green and everything, and that's, you have to shade 50% of your parking areas now, and no grass unless it's for an athletic field, so, there's some changes.
Yeah, and that's the other side is the water consumption is changing our
Yeah.
landscape, so.
And they give you no money for this either, so.
I think there's some exceptions if you have purple pipe.
Not much.
Other comments?
Yeah, on page dash 12 on 1.2.3 under seismic hazards, you list earthquakes, but would we be in the tsunami zone if there was an earthquake off the coast of California, especially coming in through the bay? I mean, would we here have to worry about tsunamis at all or rising water from that? Because it's not really mentioned under earthquakes.
I don't think so, because
I-
if you think about a tsunami approaching from the Pacific, it first has to get through the Golden Gate.
Right.
And then it's gonna diffuse in the San Francisco Bay, and then it's gonna have some kind of pulse that goes up each of the waterways and some small, we.
More like a king tide.
Well, I don't even know there would be that, so I think
Okay,
it's,
I was just curious.
interesting question, I think.
That's all our water goes through the strait. So it would that any kind of tsunami would have a difficulty.
Yeah, it just, there's a lot of choke points where it would be chopped down, so
Okay.
I think we would be okay.
On page 1-17, 1.2.4 under wildfires, it says the potential months are August, September, and October, but by Mother's Day, all the grasses are all golden by then. So I would think that fire season could be earlier because it's all dry by Mother's Day.
It's not dry like it is after the summer heat and before the rains.
But it's not green anymore.
Yeah, but typical fire season in California is August, September, mainly October.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's when the big wildfires go through is October and like this year, I mean, it's stuff still green. So.
Okay.
I think we're going to have to adjust to a new norm for fire season. I think we just had some tremendous fires that came, late fall. Their fire season seems to be January to December now.
And it's only for wildfires. You're not having to worry about grain fires because that would be accurate for grain fires out in the hills. I mean, that's what
Grain
everybody goes on
fires
fire watch
Yeah.
in
big
May and
grass.
June.
Yeah, that is our wildfire risk. So, it's the fields around us.
Okay.
We have no wooded fire risk, so.
Right. So
So-
wheat harvest is in May and June. It's not in September and October.
Okay,
So,
so,
But those are the kind of fires that are usually contained by roadways, Highway 12 and the other roadways versus when you have a big wildfire, it's going in the treetops and that's how it travels through and
your
jumps
definition is
freeways
different.
and the rivers and the sloughs and all of that
Right.
kind of stuff. When
But-
it's more of a grass fire, it burns up to those and stops.
But because of the winds that we have here, that would basically,
It's
mean,
not the
change that.
same kind of embers as they say. It's it's because the bark in the trees that are from the treetops that are blowing those across.
maybe I've never heard the term grain fire. What are we thinking about? Like,
The hay fields.
but once it's harvested, isn't the fire risk?
Yeah, the
greatly
fire risk,
But
reduced?
sometimes when they harvest, that's when
Ah.
the danger happens is, the tractor drives over a rock and it sparks and
So
the field
it's,
catches on fire.
Is that,
every vehicle that's got a catalytic converter has the potential to light a
Yeah.
grain fire. Harvesters have a potential to
Right.
light a grain fire. So you even as you're harvesting, you're having to carry extra water or you're carrying fire extinguishers, et cetera, to try to put it out before you get to the point where it's jumping highways, et cetera. But that happens in that earlier time frame because the seeds are there. You've got the oil from the seeds. That's what actually sparks it. And so in the hills, grain fires are an issue and they're just not
when is harvest?
May, June.
June.
May, June?
Yeah.
And at that time the fields are pretty dry by that time.
Right, because you
Mhm.
want to
You wait
do it
till
dry
they're
'cause you
dry
want the
before
high
you harvest.
protein.
Right.
And so you need it as dry as you can get it.
Learn something new every meeting.
Just come
And
But
I,
every year, there's usually some kind of fire out there in the field. It's just usually contained much faster and it doesn't spread as fast and.
and then I have one more. 1-18, the natural gas wells. How are the non-functioning gas wells monitored for leaks, especially since gas at that point doesn't have a scent added to it?
All of the gas wells are registered with the state of California and they are required to submit reports and monitor their wells even when they are not using them until they're permanently capped. And so it's a state requirement. It doesn't go through the city at all. So we don't see those. I do have a list of idle wells and we have asked the state to request that they cap them or cap themselves. And the state has come back and said that they don't have the funding to do so. But I do have a list of them if you are interested in seeing where the idle wells are, but they are still required to report and monitor and.
But I guess what I'm saying is if the average person is walking out in that area and there's gas leaking, we would never smell it because at that point there isn't any odor to it. So how would we know that we're in danger from a leaking well?
Well, it's.
Thank you.
You wouldn't have, it's not like it's leaking in your house where it's a confined space. Usually gas dissipates in the air. So, but that's the whole reason why they require them to maintain them and monitor them and test them.
Okay.
I don't know exactly what the monitoring entails, but I do know we have one at the courtyard and they come out every quarter and they have to, a certified guy comes out and tests them and does all the stuff and then sends a report to the state.
Is that because the
It's
property
an idle well.
It's an idle well, but is that because the property is inhabited as opposed to the empty fields? They monitor all those gas wells out there too?
They're supposed to monitor all of them.
Okay.
And it's whoever owns the well. It's not expensive to monitor them. It's expensive to cap them.
Cap 'em. Okay.
Great. Looking forward to the next meeting. We will be bringing you the draft circulation and mobility element of the general plan. We may be bringing you economic development. I understand that it's the economic development strategy will soon be presented to the city council, and we wanted to get that to you before going forward with the economic development element. So the timing on that is a little bit tentative at this point, but that's sitting out there on the horizon. With circulation and economic development, you will have received all chapters, all elements of the general plan. And then what we are going to do, Nick, myself, and our team, is we're going to start going back through all of those elements, making sure their treatment is consistent, coordinated, internal consistency between elements, and start moving towards a complete public review draft element. So that's where we're going with the document itself. The environmental impact report for the general plan is underway now. Circulation traffic counts have been taken. They're beginning to draft the sections of the EIR. They've been incorporating the policies that we've been developing as potential mitigation measures. Our goal is that we will be looking at an adoption in spring of 24. There's some time lag here to complete the environmental impact report, plus it will allow for 45-day public review period before it can go into hearings. We're envisioning somewhere in relatively early 24, we're going to hold a community meeting where we'll have the entire general plan available. It will be posted up. The community will be able to see it, come in and ask questions. So there'll be, a less formal than this meeting where the public can see the general plan. And then after that, we'll be queuing up to go hearings at the Planning Commission, City Council. So we're starting to see the finish line on this process. Let's see. We did want to ask you, is the working group committed to meeting on January 4th? Are you interested in pushing? That would be your first Thursday, but it is right after New Year's, right after Christmas, and it will be a bit challenging to have material prepared for you ahead of time because we'll have to have any packet for that meeting done, the earlier part of December so that we don't run into the Christmas kind of slowdown time. So thoughts? Do you want to stay with January 4?
Currently, there's nothing on the calendar for the 11th in this room.
I'm fine either way.
It doesn't matter to me either.
Yeah, the
Okay,
11th works.
then we'll push to the 11th if that's okay with this group.
When would we have a copy of the draft to be able to review? I would like a copy prior to that meeting. My understanding is that's, I mean, if we're getting 7 elements all together, to have a
Mhm.
chance to think through it, to have a chance to review it, to have any meaningful input on either of those dates, it would be great to have it.
We'll be communicating as to whether we're actually ready to get that to you, because I think that puts a lot of burden on us to get it out to you. We may need to push that meeting candidly if we're trying to get an entire general plan all, consistent and reviewed. That's a relatively heavy lift between now and the end of December.
Can it
So
be
Maybe-
broken apart?
Yeah, I agree.
it could be,
Can it be broken apart as opposed to the whole thing at once?
absolutely.
I think
I
that's
think
better.
that might be easier to swallow and digest.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we'll look at coming forward with a block of elements for the 11th. That's a doable task for staff because I'm starting to swing into looking at those elements right now. So Nick is as well, so. We'll
okay.
commit to, how far in advance do you need them?
Well, at least 48 hours. I would prefer a week, but.
Oh, a week's minimum. Yeah, at least a week.
And if you are gonna break them into parts, could we have them be like 1, 2, 3, not 1, 5, 7?
No, we like to keep you on your toes. We'll probably go with land use, circulation, and possibly something else. It's less important about the numbering sequence in the general plan than it is the relationship of the elements, I think.
Right.
Land use and circulation just go hand in hand. So we'll look at that, maybe, parks, public facilities are good additional ones. Those are kind of, elements with physical improvements that have a relationship. So we'll look at that, but we'll plan on getting 3 or 4 related elements together for your review.
So Paul, when you look at doing that, due to the holidays and stuff, it should be sent, whatever you can combine to have out before the week of Christmas. That would be like a limit on staff time too. It would have to go out. KB would need to get that out that week before. So like the 18th or 19th of December.
Yeah, I just.
Due to, I
I-
mean, just
I
the
think-
whole holidays and stuff.
Yeah,
I mean, there's
Are
just
you-
no
are you
days.
Shut down for the week.
Well, KB will be here, but it's all about like 2 days a week.
My staff may take over on the distribution of this packet because we'll probably need that time. Nick, I think Nick's muted, so he can't respond. I'll just have him work on Christmas. Thank you, Nick. We appreciate it.
No
Yeah,
problem.
because like I would say that, would have, for city staff, you'd have to have it out by the 21st of December, which is the Thursday before Christmas.
And that would be very challenging. So I think the point of going to the 11th is to have a little bit of extra time to work. So if that means that we take over distribution, that's fine. We can do that.
So the element as a whole, how many parts do you think would be broken down to?
How many blocks of elements?
Yes,
At most 3.
okay, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think we don't have another 6 months to review 2 elements at a time at this point. So we want to start moving towards the finish line.
Everybody
I
good
do
with
think
that?
there's going to be some benefit once you have all the pieces too. You really can easily flip back and forth. of What was in this element? What was in that?
Is it an option to cancel the January meeting and just send them all out electronically for them to review prior? So then they have like a whole month to review? If you want them to be able to flip back and forth? Is there value to that?
There may well be. We're trying to stay on a schedule here, but I just honestly, in my gut, feel like we're pushing really hard to get to a meeting on the 11th. And we're now starting to chunk it up into smaller pieces and maybe not have as much review time. I would ask that you give us a little attitude on, see where we're at.
Well, maybe at the December meeting, we'll have a better idea then, and then we can figure it out
Yeah.
where we want it on the 11th or the 4th or whatever after.
We'll know a lot more at the December meeting, so we'll revisit this.
Okay.
Great.
All right.
Everybody.
Anybody
Reviewing
have
it.
anything else?
Yes, quick question. Now that California Forever is much more out there, visible, do you see any changes or anything on the general plan that is going to be impacted by what's going on with them?
Absolutely. That's one of the things we have to do is we're going to be cycling back through land use. We're going to be looking at circulation. It's going to it's going to impact economic development. There's a lot of changes. Unfortunately, we don't know what California City or California Forever is yet. They don't know where their development is going. They don't know what their phases of development are going to be. They don't know a lot about how development is going to roll out, or at least they're not sharing it with us at this point. So we know it's big, we know it's relatively close, and we know there will be impacts. So if we were doing this plan 3 years from now, we would probably have a better sense about what California Forever is.
All right. If there's nothing else, I'd like to thank everybody. You have some? No?
No.
I'd like to thank everybody and have a great Thanksgiving and see everybody in December.
Thank you.